Page 92. The spirit residing within the human being, which embodies a part of the creation itself, uses the material body only to be able to exist on the battlefield of earth, to walk on it, and to fulfill its existence. After a given time, the spirit leaves this battlefield again, as it escapes from the material body and changes over into purely spiritual spheres. The earth human being calls this death and dying of the body. The spirit, however, is immortal and floats through the spaceless and timeless duration of all eternity. Its accumulated knowledge, its wisdom, truth, and love will never be lost to it, even if they are unknown to the living human being as a result of the necessary evolution and worldly influences. The experience through endless times of the eternity teaches that the unfolding of the powers of all kinds which are slumbering in a life form and the later life and evolution way represents a visible trail of a way that cannot be pursued through school education, book knowledge, vocational training, and traditions. The spiritual view through the times shows that each spirit form, when descending to the earth, therefore, its incarnation through the possession of a body of material form, already brings with it its talents and capabilities, because in earlier forms of existence, through hard searching, researching, and finding, it has already worked them out and has acquired them via the material consciousness. According to the age of the spirit, the material consciousness is therefore knowing to a greater or lesser extent, or it is already highly evolved and wise. But where worldly and material influences make a life form enslaved in a consciousness-based manner, the further development and utilization of the already accumulated powers are simply suspended. Even to the unknowing human being it must be clear that all life forms are different in age, so therefore also the spirit forms. Thus also the spirit of the human being has had its hour of birth and will have it forever. As the becoming and passing is of eternal duration, so, in the process of the evolution of the creation itself, new spirits are constantly being created. This has taken place before Ur times, and is also still happening today and in all future. Accordingly, it must be comprehensible to the earth human being that there are young and old, older and very old spirit forms, which conditioned by law naturally also belong to different levels of spiritual evolution, just as this is also the case with the earth human beings themselves in their material life, because there are also young and old life forms, and also their knowledge and ability are evolved highly in different manners. In the spiritual levels of higher standing, the old and matured spirit forms draw from the experiences of their past and lived through steps of evolution and carry within themselves the law-based creational responsibility to selflessly disseminate from the very rich treasure of their inner life, eternal knowledge, truth, wisdom, and love, but only in places where the soil has become loosened up, prepared, and fertile. The earth human beings also live in this form according to the same law, even if they continuously disregard and trample it into the dirt, for which they inevitably have to constantly bear the consequences. It would therefore be better for them if they followed an old proverb, that namely he or she should not throw the pearls before the swine. He or she may take an example of great spirit forms, of high spiritual levels, which only give away their pearls in places where they are treasured in honor and wisdom as the light of the truth. The earth human beings consider themselves to be very wise, but all wisdom is lacking for them. They may be very knowing in worldly material areas, but when it comes to the concerns of the spirit, they are unknowing and unwise, like the unknowing and unwise nothing. If they direct their eyes to the immediate present of their lives for a start, then they must soberly realize the evil fact that despite all the hardships and experiences they have lived through, they are standing on an unfertilized and rock-hard ground which is incapable of taking in and germinating the seeds of the knowledge and the wisdom. Despite all the evil hardships and bitter experiences which the human race had to gather on earth, it had not loosened up the soil of the finding, so that the seed could be sown. However, where the ground is hard and resembles the rock, only surface weeds such as mosses and the like, slimy fungi and parasites are able to settle. Growths which spread over the surface and cover the ground and deprive it of the light. The beguiling smells of the parasites, however, the freeloaders, impregnate in a stupefying manner the atmosphere with their sweetish lewdness and attract thereby all sorts of vermin. Stupefied, they fall victim to the parasites, decompose, and spread a penetrating stench. The earth human being's fertile soil of the truth has solidified into rugged rocks and is overlaid with worldly material and religious things which absorb and destroy all truth within themselves. Rubbish which is able to bring forth deadly consequences, and this rubbish must be taken away by the earth human being if he or she does not want to suffocate as a result of it. Already for a time, they are no longer master of themselves and resemble an aimlessly hurled cork in a wavy, stormy sea. Without rudder and sail they drift away, and the helmsman has already long since fallen overboard. Particularly the youth of the earth, humankind, is in dismal condition. Not only those who, through politics and religious sects, have fallen prey to evil irrational teachings, but also those who have not lent their ears to any religious and political enticements. Their lives permeate in views which are malicious creations of a worldly and material unspirituality, creations full of false ideals and irrational teachings. Youth of the earth humankind, descendants of the earthly race, cries of freedom ring out from their lips, but they do not know the sense of the freedom and its use. Boastfully, they speak of truth and love, but do not know the feelings of the love, and they assume the belief to be the truth. This, however, is no reason to simply curse the youth of the earth humankind and to shrug them off, because they lack only the necessary guidance, the powers which show them the way to the knowledge and to the truth. Their receptivity is more flexible than that of the older human beings, whose senses are afflicted, muzzled, and burdened in unknowledge of the truth, through evil experiences, hardships, unresolved problems, wars, burdens, and sufferings of all kinds, through which they have been oppressed into a dullness with the increasing wish for an end to their life through the death. It is the obligation of the leading powers of the earth to adopt measures for the consciousness-based and spiritual evolution of the youth, to entrust them to the guidance of spiritual human beings, and to keep them away from the material intellectuals. The earthly youth grows up in erroneous assumptions and evil irrational teachings, an insanity which must be put to an end. Spiritual guides of high values must take the guidance over these young human beings and lead them to the truth, teach them the distinction between the imperishable truth and the passing unrealistic views of the beliefs of the human beings. For what does the young earth human being of the present time still know about the eternal truth of the Spirit, about the creation, and about the part piece of creation, the Spirit which resides in the human being? The young earth human being must receive the teaching that a creational part is existent within him or her, namely the Spirit. He or she must be instructed that this Spirit within him or her stands higher than his or her material consciousness and his or her body, which should not be cared for in excess, for otherwise the consciousness becomes stunted and disadvantaged. It must, however, also be taught that the human intellect and the rationality do not embody the Spirit, and that the necessary nourishment must be given to the Spirit as well as to the material body itself. Because it is a brazen law of the creation that everything which lives and existence must be maintained with food and drink, whether it is of a material or spiritual nature. Material life forms require material food and drink, and spiritual life forms need spiritual food and drink, which are recognition, knowledge, truth, wisdom, and love. The young earth human being must also receive the teaching of the fact that time immemorial religious teachings are erroneous and lead into the abyss, quite especially those teachings that explain a Trinity, which has also been carried over to the life of the earth human beings by the Christian religious teachings. It is therefore to be taught that only a oneness can ever be existent in the form that this oneness can be divided into two sub-onenesses, which, however, each within themselves again form a oneness. So therefore, if a trinity is taught in the human being, namely spirit, soul, and body, then this means a falsified, unreal teaching. Spirit and soul embody one and the same thing, which measured according to religious standards. This is because the religious irrational teaching created the evil assertion that the spirit is a godly being, but the soul is a human spiritual being. This, however, is unreal because solely the creational spiritual vase and form resides within the human being. So therefore, according to religious standards, the designations and denominations quote spirit and quote soul must be combined into one value, in which case both together are absolutely inseparable because the spirit cannot be split within itself. The designation quote soul had, at the beginning, a fully different meaning than that which has been interpreted by the earth human being for several thousands of years. Originally, and before the erroneous falsifications by uncomprehending human beings, that part of the earth human being was called soul, which in the present time is designated as psyche. The denomination quote soul means therefore in truth psyche. In earlier times, uncomprehending and unknowing earth human beings were not able to analyze and to comprehend psychical impulsations, especially because the psyche is the actual receiver and processor of the sender's and emitter's feelings. In the unknowledge of these facts, the uncomprehending earth human beings believed that the psyche, therefore the soul, was a spiritual life form and thus the human counterpart to the quote godly spirit. This erroneous view was developed into an irrational teaching and spread globally over the course of time. As if it were not enough that scientifically highly educated human beings, who, in their early times and in their language were called Ishwishes, Ishwish equals wisdom king, or king of wisdom, that is, God, raised themselves to the almightiness and thus to the creation itself. In order to aid and abet the consciousness enslavement and the exploitation, a purely human spirit form, or the alleged soul, which truly embodies the psyche, was invented in addition, which was as imaginary as the gods who were exalted to the creation, who had to be worshipped in order to complete the debasing and enslaving submissiveness. Already the submissive form of the prayers, in a religious sense, attested to the boundless imperiousness of the gods and their representatives, which ought to have fundamentally made the earth human beings think. But they did not do so, because it seemed better to them to have some might over themselves, even if it only existed in the imagination to which they could pass off their own responsibility at any time. With the mention of the prayer, however, one factor has come to the fore which must be named. Originally, the form of the prayer was intended to thereby develop a life form spiritually and in a consciousness-based manner, in that prayers were spoken which were fundamentally directed at his or her own spirit and his or her consciousness, as well as his or her consciousness power and capabilities, which were to be evolved. These prayers were clothed in mostly incomprehensible words for the life form, but in purely human word values. Through the constant repetition of these prayers to one's own consciousness and to one's own spirit, the consciousness was slowly activated and evolved itself in the sense of the spoken or thought of prayers. In later times, however, as gods and religions made an appearance, the prayers were misused and transformed into worships for the gods, tin gods, and holy places. This resulted in a very evil and unreal dependency on imaginary things of all kinds, through which the autonomy of the life form, in this case of the earth human being, has been destroyed. Particularly at the present time with the earth humankind, these forms of unreal prayers have again been pressed extraordinarily strongly into the foreground by the boundless prevalence of religiously instilled anxiety in relation to the onset of the New Age and an alleged end of the world connected with it and a godly judgment. This was already the case at the time of the turn of the millennium according to the Christian calendar, when the first millennium was extended by the second. Religious fanatics and know-it-alls were already at work at that time and drove the religion-dependent earth human beings into anxiety, fright, and despair. Thousands upon thousands of people destroyed their lives at that time because they feared the supposed judgment of God, which, according to the fanatical speeches of the religious believers and know-it-alls, was to befall the earth humankind. So, just as today, at that time around 1,000 years ago, the earth human beings were also driven into the insanity with religious, fanatic, irrational teachings. In comparison to that time, however, it is much worse in the present time, because the Ausartungen that are accompanying the change of time exert their influences. This means that the transition from one cosmic age to another is connected with Ausartungen of great scale. Ausartungen that are relevant to facts which very much affect a life form in great numbers, so in the case of the earth human beings, thus the religion. Inevitably, therefore, very enormous excesses and Ausartungen in this direction are connected to the change of the time. New religious sects shoot out of the ground like evil weeds. New end-of-the-world prophecies and God judgment prophecies flood the earth humankind, and time immemorial religions fight with all means for the preservation and redistribution of their irrational teachings. All malicious and unrealistic attempts, on the one hand, to contain the unnecessary deadly anxiety of the earth human being of something unreal, imaginary, with unreal and never to be realized, empty and fantasy-filled promises of morbid fantasy desires, and on the other hand, not to lose and to newly solidify the enslaving and exploiting might in religious and political respects over the human being. All in all, therefore, only malicious attempts to curtail the earth human being in every respect in their consciousness-based freedom, and, above all, to obstruct the way to this freedom already in all beginnings. With uncountable earth human beings of the present time, the religion, and therefore also the unreal prayer, have again found extraordinary reverberation. And arrogantly they believe, through their views of their religious irrational teachings, and through the performing of humiliating worship which make them unfree, to be superior to their fellow human beings, and believe that they are of more value than them. What a dangerous delusion, however, for it is precisely the non-believing fellow human beings who are the searching and researching ones, and especially will be the first who will come to the recognition of the truth, while those who are dependent on religion will still for a long time through their irrational teachings, have to walk along in affliction and tribulation. Through their irrational teachings, they condemn the Spirit and the truth, and walk in the deepest impenetrable darkness. But they as well, however, will have to realize, at the end, that in the last conclusion, the truth of the Spirit can only bubble out of one single source, namely, from the spiritual source of the all-pervading, eternal, and imperishable power of creation. For a long time, the earth human being has more or less regarded the substantial, the material, and worldly, the graspable, measurable, and weighable, as the only thing real. In which case, the high, unnameable values of the unmeasurable and unweighable, the eternal, the spiritual, and the creational have entered into the senses as a mere waste. And in order that the earth humankind does not continue to stray in this consciousness desolation, all the words and explanations transmitted so far, and which will still continue to follow, shall be given to them. The time has come for these transmissions, because the human being should not get even more deeply into the entanglements of their earthly world and bring the cosmic laws and recommendations into turmoil in unharmonious doings. Evil storms with world-shaking accompanying phenomena have in the last 40 years thrown destructive and deadly storm surges over the earth. But what has the earth human being learned from all these occurrences? Nothing in and of itself, because in their worldly, material sense, the human beings have not heard and have overlooked the silent admonition of the nature and the time.